Welcome everyone to our webinar. I am Rodrigo Silva, the Communications Manager at Cogitatio. Today we are discussing the organizational form of several right-wing parties in Europe, a discussion based on the thematic issue, right-wing populist party organization across Europe, the survival of the mass party, which was published in the open access journal Politics and Governance. I will share the link to the issue very soon. Our expert panel today is composed by the co-editor, Stijn van Kessel, from the Queen Mary University of London, Judith Sijstermans and Niko Hatakka, both from the University of Birmingham in the UK, and Paul Taggart from the University of Sussex in the UK, who will provide the comments to the presentations. Before we kick this event off, some information to our attendees. So this is the order of presentations for today. Stijn will go first, followed by Judith and Niko, and then Paul will provide the final remarks. After Paul's presentation, we'll go to the Q&A session. So to our attendees, you are able to write your questions in the Q&A format on the bottom of the screen. Vote for those questions as well, if you see some that is of your interest. And in the end, we'll ask these questions to our speakers. Also, if you're on Twitter, do follow our, we invite you to follow our page at Cogitatio Pag. You can see in the bottom of the screen to be in touch with our call for papers, publications, the impact of our research on news outlets, blogs, etc. Without further delay, I'll pass now the word to Stijn, and I wish you all a very, very pleasant webinar. Thank you.
Thanks very much, Rodrigo. You can hear me, I presume? Yeah, it's okay. Thanks very much for organizing this meeting. It's been a pleasure to work with you and also the publisher in general. The people of the journal were really amazing, and organizing this thematic issue has been as smooth as it can be. Yeah, we were so well supported. This thematic issue that I'm going to introduce now, and then I'll let Niko and Judith present one of or two case studies of this particular thematic issue on Belgium and Finland. I'll briefly introduce the general thematic issue and also the broader theoretical context in which it's embedded. So the thematic issue is part of the Populism in Action project, which is led by principal investigator Daniele Albertazzi, and I'm involved as co-investigator. And with the team members, two of which you see here on stage, Niko Hatakka and Judith Sijstermans, and also Adrian Favero and Mattia Zulianello. So it's a team of 6 people. And what we study is really this the question about the mass party surviving amongst parties of the populist radical right. So I'll introduce this a bit more extensively here. So the research is basically situated in the broader literature on developments of parties as organizations. And it engages in particular with the observations that parties abandon their representative and linkage functions. So the 20th century saw the rise of political parties characterized by large memberships organized in local branches, the so-called mass parties. But now it's widely assumed that the age of these so-called mass parties is over. So citizens are said to turn their backs on traditional politics, but also established political parties are argued to disengage from the democratic arena, and they contribute to this general process of partisan de-alignment, because parties of the current age can communicate with potential supporters directly via traditional media or via the new media, and they don't really need to seek to build this mass membership anymore, because they don't need to have people on the ground, members campaigning for them anymore. They can campaign directly through mass media. So Peter Mayer has, for instance, spoken about a shift towards audience democracy, where people are mere spectators, and a mutual disengagement with the democratic practice. So both citizens disengage and political elites disconnect, and this combines, he argued, leads to a hollowing out of democracy. So this is quite a pessimistic conclusion. However, it has been observed that several new parties are in fact still holding on to features of the mass party model. They are present on the ground, they focus on shaping people's identities, and seek to involve members in a variety of activities. This model is also popular among some right-wing populist parties. So this is the type of parties that we are focusing on in our research. This is a type of party that arguably presents the greatest electoral threat to traditional parties, especially on the center right. So besides the cultural conservatism of these right-wing populist parties and their anti-immigration stances, one key element of these parties is their populism. They make a normative distinction between corrupt or unresponsive elites and the ordinary people they claim to represent. So these populist parties criticize traditional parties precisely for having lost touch with ordinary people and for their remoteness to ordinary citizens. So given their commitment to bridging the gap between citizens and the political elites, do these populist parties in fact have the capacity to bring party organizations back to life? And what we theorize in our research is that the key features of the mass party model will suit right-wing populist parties particularly well, since the creation and fostering of partisan communities can lend credence to their claim that they are of and for the ordinary people. So I'll show a slide now with the contributors of the special issue, if I manage to do so, to give credit to those who deserve credit, and some are in the audience. I think also, can you see the slides?
Yes, we can.
Working fine? Yeah, okay. So these are the case studies that we discuss in our thematic issues. So the broader project of the Populist Parties in Action program, the aim is to understand why 4 typical cases of populist radical right mass parties adopt the model of the mass party from the perspective of both party members as well as party elites. So we rely a lot on interviews with both party elites as well as ordinary grassroots members. However, for this special issue, which is also part of our project, we broaden the scope beyond these typical populist radical right mass parties, and we include 12 case studies of a broader set of right-wing populist parties, which is a slightly broader category across Europe. And of course, for this special issue, we were helped by all these amazing scholars who provided an analysis of one such party across Europe. So we asked these contributors each 2 guiding empirical questions. So first of all, to what extent and how do right-wing populist parties invest in developing the mass party organizational model? So for this thematic issue, we don't start out from the assumption that all these parties are in fact mass parties, but we ask, if we look at this broad set of right-wing populist parties, to what extent do they actually adopt, and which of them, and to what extent do they adopt mass party features? It makes sense to provide a brief definition of what we understand by mass parties. So first of all, we identify the following key features on the basis of the literature. A, the drive to recruit large activist membership as a way to reach out to the public through canvassing, campaigning, and other means. B, rootedness on the ground and the provision of a variety of activities to members. And C, the preservation of collective identities through ideology by creating closed political communities of activists, promoting social integration among them, and actively shaping their interpretation of political development. So this latter element relates very much to the socialization of these members within the parties. The second question we asked to all these contributors is, to what extent do right-wing populist parties remain centralized in terms of key decision-making areas such as ideological direction, campaigning, and internal procedures? So note that also the mass parties of the 20th century were not necessarily internally democratic. So mass parties involve their members into party activities. They foster an active party life. However, they do not necessarily provide these members with meaningful influence over party decisions, be it candidate selections or strategic choice, etc. I'll stop sharing the screen now, so I'm back. So yeah, these are the 2 guiding questions. I'll briefly hint at some of the key findings that we present in our special issue in the concluding section before I give the floor to Judith and Niko to delve deeper into the cases of Belgium and Finland. So some of the key comparative observations have a little bit rough because of course there's quite a lot of cross-case variety, but what we observe is that many of these cases that I just showed, they often build complex organizations characterized by widespread territorial presence. So they have local chapters in which they engage in various activities. They are also characterized by communities of dedicated activities, practices of member socialization, for instance, through the organization of social events and activities. So what we also find is that traditional canvassing and campaigning activities are still very important. So it's not the case that these have disappeared in the age of modern media, the social media in particular. So social media often facilitate internal party communication and are also used as a way to connect with potential recruits, but also often serve to promote more traditional in-person events. And some of these events, like marketplace events or canvassing and campaigning efforts, they are important because they allow the party indeed to show their keenness, or they show that the parties are in fact a legitimate political actor that attract normal people that are not extremists, etc. So this presence on the ground actually allows the party to build an image of parties that are not beyond the pale, so to speak. There are some exceptions to the rules in terms of building these mass party type organizations. So Law and Justice, for instance, in Poland, or Forum for Democracy in the Netherlands, they kind of shy away from attracting more members or building extensive organizations. And that's seemingly the case because these parties show great concern for maintaining control and keeping a lightweight organizational model in order to prevent internal conflicts to emerge. Because of course, if you build a large organization with many members, the risk is that you create instability. And some of these right-wing populist parties clearly want to prevent that. Another case is obviously the Dutch Party for Freedom of Geert Wilders, which is basically a one-man show. So it's not the case that all right-wing populist parties adopt a mass party model. That's not what we're claiming also. But certainly a lot of them do adopt various features of the mass party. We also asked about centralization, or where does power ultimately lie? Do these parties also provide members with meaningful decision-making power? We find that irrespective of whether these parties foster active membership, they are typically characterized by concentration of power inside their organization. So these organizations are typically dominated by their leader alongside a small group of sort of elite representatives serving in the party executive. So in general, there's a limited means for ordinary members in these radical right-wing populist parties to influence the party course, although there's still some variation. So there are cases like the Finns, in fact, but also the alternative for Germany, which offer members with a bit more meaningful means to have a say about party decisions. So 3 key conclusions, you might say. So right-wing populist parties are often more than vessels for personalistic leadership. This is often how they're still portrayed. That populism is often associated with charismatic leadership. This is not always the case. They often invest in membership and activities, not least to show that they are a legitimate political actor. This also means, more generally speaking, that there's no one-way shift away from the mass party model. It seems that these days there are still parties that invest in kind of mass party organizational features. And finally, so we also find that right-wing populist parties tend to offer participation without power, as we call it. And they offer participation to their members. These members are also quite happy to be involved. And one key question for our project, and we try to find this out on the basis of interviews with grassroots members in particular, what is it that motivates these people to become involved in these parties if they are not granted any meaningful say about the party course? So I'll leave it there, and I'll give the floor now to Judith, who presents a case study of Flanders.
Thank you, Stijn, for this initial context. Judith, please, the floor is yours.
Thank you. Always a struggle unmuting. Okay, so today I'm going to be talking about the Vlaams Belang, which is a Flemish populist radical right party. And the kind of proposal of my article is that they are a modern mass party. And how do you be modern? You're online, you're digital, you've got an app, you've got social media. I mean, I think we've all seen that. I like to think of the way that people talk about the populist radical right on the internet as a kind of mythical big bad wolf that casts this long shadow. You hear about these kind of messaging boards full of kind of racist memes that are subtle or unsubtle a lot of the times. You hear about these kind of dark parts of the internet that we can't really access. So it feels like something for a younger generation in some ways and something that is niche. But actually the proposal of my article and what I found throughout the kind of 2 years of research that we did is that it's really not that obscure. So the populist radical right, they're on the kind of old people social media, just like us. They're on Facebook, they're on Instagram, and just like us, they're trying to be on TikTok. Just like us, they're mostly failing at being on TikTok, but they're managing to keep their kind of family of party political supporters together on Facebook. So I'm going to use the Vlaams Belang to explain to you how they do that, and also to propose that their use of these digital medias and the way in which they integrate digital medias with the mass party structure are both a kind of electoral, give them both electoral potential and could provide an electoral threat. So a brief overview of the Vlaams Belang, which might be a party you haven't heard of before. The party traces its roots back to the late 1970s. It's a Flemish nationalist party as well as a populist radical right party. So it balances these two. It balances a support for Flemish independence, ostensibly, although they don't talk about it a lot, with a nativist and populist platform. So the party has had a lot of electoral fluctuations, but let's stay in the present. They came second place in the May 2019 elections in Belgium, which were Flemish, federal, and European elections, so a big one. And for the last couple of years, and in the latest Belgian poll, they've been the most popular party in Flanders with 25% of the electoral support. So it's not really a niche party in the dark parts of the internet, as you might expect when you think about the kind of populist right on the internet. And in fact, the party's success is built on a lot of traditional workings of the mass party, which have been rejuvenated by kind of tech-savvy digital methods and tech-savvy digital people. So they've got a kind of new leadership, a new team of leaders, foremost among them, the party leader, Tom van Grieken, who, when he was elected to be the party leader, was the youngest ever Belgian party leader. And he has a kind of small group of tech-savvy politicians around him. Okay, so in terms of their electoral success, which I think is what people often want to know about when they want to know about the populist radical right, the Vlaams Belang has struggled against a kind of tide of people being uninterested in joining political parties, just like other political parties. So in my first round of interviews, a lot of people were saying to me, look, people just don't join political parties anymore. Clearly also trying to stem any kind of possible critique of falling party membership numbers in the Vlaams Belang. But what the party found and what I found is that people don't necessarily need to sign up and get a membership card to feel like they're part of the party's wider community. So we can talk about a populist radical right mass party without talking about large membership numbers. And that's something which we try to emphasize in our work. So the party's representatives they're pretty obsessed with telling me how many Facebook followers they have. They keep updated on it. And it's not just the party that looks to have a lot of Facebook followers. It's also Tom van Grieken, the party's leader. So they try to grow this kind of dual social media following. Van Grieken is particularly active on Instagram, where he builds a kind of individualist profile, you know, kind of cute pictures of him with his son, painting the hallway walls in his new house, lots of selfie videos. And he's done better on TikTok than most of us would probably do. But the party recognizes that a Facebook following and Instagram following is more fickle and less active than someone with a membership card, right? Having a membership card in your wallet or somewhere hidden in a drawer is a certain amount of commitment that a Facebook follower might not give. So they'd like to transition this online support to a more direct contact with the party. So this occurs in a couple of different ways, and this is the kind of physical digital connection, which one of our colleagues has tried to call phygital. I won't go that far, but there's a certain pipeline, right? So this might occur through encouraging people to become formal members, right? On the Facebook saying, hey, do you want to join to be a member of our party? And staffers and most respondents suggested that it was about half of members join using the online form and half still join in that kind of traditional way, you know, someone comes to your door and asks you to be a member. But there are less formal ways of getting people in direct contact with the party, which I think are much more interesting for us and are much more kind of on the cutting edge of using the internet. So one way I saw emerging even over the 2 years that I was studying them is WhatsApp. So, for example, they were organizing a big demonstration, and attendees were encouraged to join these WhatsApp groups to see where they could meet up for the demonstration. And there you go, the party has their phone number, right? And it's very subtle in that way. Another campaign they've launched was encouraging people to register as a voter. There's a kind of small literature on how political parties have had different forms of affiliation. And this is one of those ways, right? So you might register as a voter, but you don't feel that's as serious as having a membership card. And this might be particularly important for a populist radical right party that might have more stigma against them, right? So they asked people to register as a voter, and in return, they got a face mask, the very COVID relevant campaign. And again, there we go, a whole new raft of contact details, right? People register their address because they need to get their face mask sent to them, and the party can then use this data. So the data is then inputted into an app. Local branches and active branch members are trained to use the app. The app sends them to the houses of the people who registered as voters. And there we go. They try to recruit members. They put a human face on the party, so those people feel the party is active locally. And so in-person campaigning is facilitated by digital methods. And I think Stijn was talking about that a bit, about how the mass party is rooted on the ground, but we can see how that rootedness on the ground isn't necessarily mutually exclusive from being rooted on the internet, so to speak. All of this is facilitated by a certain amount of professionalization, right? You need to create the app, you need to keep the data, you need to have certain permissions for the data, right? All this GDPR. So there has been a kind of digital professionalization within the VLAMs Belang, which we see. So since their electoral successes in 2019, the party has more than tripled its staff members. And a lot of those staff were social media staff, right? It's a skill, it's an art. But it isn't just about people who are Facebook savvy or Instagram savvy in Brussels. It's also about having local staffers. So I spoke to a number of these new provincial staffers hired by the party. And they talked about how a lot of their work is based in digital expansion. So they train local branch members to use Facebook, and they have direct control over all the local Facebook pages, so they can post directly on there. And of course, through that, they keep an eye on how members use social media. So the party knows that its electoral boom using the internet can also become an electoral catastrophe. And this is why they try to centrally control it, right? So we've had examples of this. Recently, a kind of a high-profile one was that a local party councillor had dressed in kind of traditional Flemish clothing and left flowers at the graveside of a Nazi. One of the party's executive members, maybe 5-10 years ago, was posting a lot of racist memes online. And so they know they've managed to kind of, they need to manage these events. And part of the way they do that is through professionalizing and having staff who are controlling that rootedness in Facebook and on the ground. Their ability to control people, their ability to, for example, continue to post on local Facebook pages without kind of raising concern from the local members, ultimately relies on buy-in from those members and on the popularity of the party's leader, Tom van Rieken, who was in my interviews kind of widely loved. But that buy-in and that popularity might not always be there. And so we might see that this kind of online infrastructure, which has led to this modern mass party, and I propose to this modern electoral success of the party, may still crumble if that buy-in and that kind of connection between the members and the central party die. And just a quick aside, I spoke to both the new guard of the party and the old guard. And perhaps to paraphrase them, the old guard were kind of saying, okay, this online stuff, it's all well and good until it isn't, until it doesn't work anymore. And then we'll see, right? So that threat remains there. And so the modern mass party might be the VLAMs Belang's great hope to finally govern, to finally overcome the cordon sanitaire in Belgium, but it also might be their Achilles heel. So I'll leave it there.
Thank you, Judith, for your presentation. Niko Hatakka now to present his article as well.
Thank you very much, Rodrigo. So, like Stijn presented earlier, the focus of the special issue was to answer the question of to what extent have these right-wing populist parties adopted elements of the traditional mass party model. And in the past 2 years, I've been conducting extensive fieldwork within the organization of the Finns party in Finland. And I've done, for example, around 50 interviews with party officials and politicians and activists. And I'm happy to present some of my findings here. So, to what extent has the Finnish party then relied on the involvement of the people on the ground? And also to what extent does the party grant their members also meaningful influence over the party's internal decision making? So I will start with a short party introduction, considering that everyone in the audience might not be familiar with the party. So the Finnish party was founded in the year 1995 on the ruins of a center-left agrarian populist party called the Finnish Rural Party. And for its first 15 years or so, the Finnish party relied both organizationally and ideologically on the heritage of its predecessor. But after the late 2000s, the party started to radicalize due to the growth of the party organization, meaning that more new people were coming in, and due to the party's increasing cooperation with these nativist and more sort of radical right-leaning online movements that had formed in Finland during the late 2000s and early 2010s. And by the around 2019 parliamentary elections, the Finnish party had officially transformed into a full-blown populist radical right party that is primarily nativist and populist at its programmatic core. And this prioritization of the native population over various foreign threats can be nicely seen, for example, in the party's newly launched slogan, Suomalainen ensin, which literally translates to the Finnish person first, or the Finn first. Now, let me explain how the party's organization has historically developed. So since the late 2000s, the Finnish party has more than tripled in its number of members. And the party has also founded around 150 new political associations since 2008. So the party has indeed grown very rapidly, and it has established a nearly comprehensive organizational presence in the Finnish municipalities. And this has meant that the party has had to very quickly, might I add, to develop these tools for providing its around 250 associations, and there are thousands of members with training, with support for doing campaigns, with assets for engaging in local debates, etc. So it's been a tremendous task, and it could not have been handled in a centralized manner directly from Helsinki. So the party solved this by granting the local chapters a considerably high degree of autonomy, meaning that the local chapters can pretty much do whatever they want as long as they don't harm the party. And unlike in Belgium, there is no hired party staff in the regions outside of Helsinki. And this means that the party has had to rely entirely on volunteers to run this vast network of associations. And this has necessitated also that the threshold for participating in the party has been kept very low. And the activists also have had rather realistic chances of advancing very rapidly in the party's ranks. And partially as a result of this, the party's associations, they vary quite significantly when it comes to the level of activities, the level of skills of the individuals involved in the associations, and also the sense of commitment and belonging experienced by the local activists. But overall, the party's actors have very much internalized this rhetoric of the party being dependent on its activists. But also that the party is also able to provide the activists with a meaningful platform to kind of fulfill their political aspirations. So then to what extent does the Finns party empower its members? And in the article, I described the party's internal democracy sort of as a Frankenstein's monster. So certain parts of the party's formal structure are very horizontal. So for example, the party is almost radically democratic when it comes to selecting the party leadership every 2 years. So all party members, they have one vote in the party congress, which directly elects the party leader, 3 vice leaders, and the party secretary. But at the same time, the party has very much centralized nearly all kind of meaningful decision-making powers to its top people. So the party's executive board, it holds power over all individual and association memberships in the party. It leads programmatic and strategic work. It has final say on national election candidacies, and it also formulates the party's rules. And even though I said that local chapters, they are expected to act on their own and independently, the party still retains the possibility of interfering and taking control directly over some problematic associations, and it has done so on several occasions. So even though the party's elites and the activists, they truly share the view of the party as a kind of a down-up citizen movement, where the grassroots are the key to the party's future direction. But when it comes to actual decisions beyond personal selections every 2 years, the members have very little formal power in the party. And here at the end, I'd also like to discuss the role of online media and how the Finns party has found a similar kind of synergies between its mass membership organization and these less organized online movements and more kind of individualized online party activism. So while the party has been able to enjoy the stability of having a formal traditional party organization, it has been simultaneously been boosted by the agility of online activists and sympathizers who actually might have very little or nothing to do with the formal party organization itself. And this has aided the party, for example, in fostering these kind of communities and a sense of purpose among activists in regions where the kind of formal organizational cultures in the party are very much underdeveloped. And this is rather significant considering that nearly half of the party members in the Finnish party actually do not have membership in a local association. So there are clear benefits for the party from not having all party activism taking place within the rather strict boundaries of the traditional mass membership organization. However, like Judith pointed out, online party activism can also pose serious challenges for party organizations in terms of their legitimacy, in their public image and future direction, as these online activists, they are not within the reach of the party's, for example, disciplinary measures, and they're not within the reach of the various means of socialization that are taking place within the actual party associations. And in the Finns party, when combined with the decentralized nature of the national leadership selection, considering the party's rather lax message discipline, especially online, and the possibility of the activists to advance quickly in the party's ranks, you could argue that this kind of a mix of having traditional and online party activism has hastened quite significantly the mainstreaming of the current radical right party regime in Finland. So currently, in terms of online activism, the party is facing increasing trouble because its originally consensual line regarding the COVID-19 pandemic and especially vaccinations is being actively currently undermined online by party activists and sympathizers, and the Finnish party elites have had significantly hard time not to join in their COVID skepticism. Therefore, to sum up, so the Finnish party can be regarded as one of the European populist radical right parties that indeed have established a mass party type of an organization, and the party has developed this kind of an extensive and well-oiled organizational machine that relies on its members to be run on its own without the need for constant steering. But the party's elite still has the ultimate possibility to grab the wheel if need be, so to speak. However, as more and more of the party's activism is being conducted on these commercial social media platforms, this also means that the party's elites' direct control over the party's messaging is also increasingly limited, which means that at the point when the party elites might realize that they need to grab the wheel now, it already could be too late. And therefore, I'd be very delighted to see more research that would try to investigate these interconnections between formal party organizations and informal online activism, as I truly believe that those interconnections could be among the key drivers of party radicalization, not only among right-wing or populist radical right parties, but also in the center-right. So thank you for your interest.
Thank you, Niko, for your presentation. Paul Taggart now for comments on the issue and the articles. Thank you.
Thanks very much. And I hope, and what I'm going to do is I'm going to comment generally on the issue, not so much on the two presentations, but the two presentations, well, sorry, the three presentations, but the two case studies exemplify what you get with this thematic issue, which is something that can be really read horizontally and vertically. There's some really great stories there on the particular parties, and not just on the party organisation. If you want a quick sketch of populist parties and radical right across the cases, there's some fantastic resources there. And also, you know, Stijn and Daniele do a fantastic job, you know, horizontally across it by making these comparative conclusions. And the first point is, and I think you heard that also in the presentations, is there is no single story. And I think that's a testimony to some really in-depth research based on some new data from a lot of the cases. And it's a real finding that the idea that we should treat the populist radical right as a monolithic entity clearly is, I think, largely exploded by what they find here. They find parties that are highly democratic, they find parties that are highly centralized, parties that have charismatic leaders, parties that don't have charismatic leaders. It's kind of almost every type there. So I think just bear in mind that this is a really nice example of comparative research showing you variation and variety. And I think that's a really important corrective to trying to over generalize about the populist radical right. So of course I'm going to say it's a good special issue. That's why I've agreed to do it, because it's good. And you wouldn't expect to say anything else. I want to say just three more points. I'll try and be as quick as I can. The first is the question is about the nature of the mass party organisation model and whether populist radical right parties have taken on that. And it's quite interesting, isn't it, that if you look at the literature on political science and on political parties, you have these different models. We have the models of the catch-all party from Kirchheimer. We have the model of the electoral professional party from Panebianco. We have the cartel model from Katz and Mayer as well, as different types of party organisations. But it's quite interesting, isn't it, that we always go back to the mass party. And I think there's a slight difficulty here, which is that I think we as political scientists, or those really interested in politics, you wouldn't be watching this webinar if you weren't. We're a bit unusual. And so somehow I think we're a bit too hardwired to think that the mass party is kind of, that's it, that's the key structure. That's the way parties organise, with activists knocking on doors and often being quite untypical of the elites or whatever. But we know mass parties are about gaining membership and so on. So why do you know what I was struck by this? I'm a man of a certain age, so you know, I listen to music, and so I listen to, you know, I'm a middle-aged Englishman, so I listen to dad rock or whatever, don't I? And I remember watching Joe Walsh of the Eagles, you know, bands that have based on guitar with harmonies and bands and the collective, and saying, actually, everyone's waiting for these guys to come back, and that's what all my generation are. We're all looking at the latest charts on Spotify that show that there are no bands in the top 5. You know, it's all individuals. Well, actually, we were expecting this to come back, but Joe Walsh said maybe that was just a weird time. The period of classic rock was that was the exception, and I wonder if the mass party is actually the exception. It's actually not like most other political parties operate. Elements of the cartel party of state subsidies, elements of the electoral professional party of relying upon media and technical professionals to help them, even elements of perhaps the original model, the cadre party, an elite-run party. And in a sense, these models suffuse all contemporary parties to some degree. And what you've got is kind of a bit of a soup. And again, trying to think that all more parties are going in a certain direction is a bit unusual. why should we focus on the mass party? But actually, counterintuitively, I think what this special issue shows you is that surprisingly, there's quite a lot of evidence that the parties here, the populist parties, are actually going back to the model that we would categorize at the beginning of the 20th century, with trying to gain members and trying to get an activist membership base. So it's quite, it's a slightly counterintuitive finding. I'll come back to that in a second. The third point I've made is about populism. And I think that you find and I think both Niko and Judith intimate this in different ways. If you look at what populism, what would you expect of a populist party? Well, some people say you'd expect charismatic leadership. I'm always actually slightly suspicious what charismatic actually means. It just means that generally it's a successful leader. It's often just personalized leadership. But anyway, let's forget that quibble for a moment. But you expect a strong leadership. Well, again, yeah, you do find that in certain cases, but you don't find that in every case. But maybe that's the populist urge, is to have somebody embodying what it is that we, the people, this amorphous mass, really want. So it's kind of natural. But again, that's not particularly confined to populist parties of the radical right. That sort of leadership and centralized structures are typical of many other parties. And what about the members? What about the members? I mean, Stijn talked about participation without power. Maybe actually that's what populism appeals to, what I call sort of a sense of unpolitics. At heart, the appeal of populism is people don't really want to fully be engaged in politics. They don't actually want to be knocking on doors on a dark February evening. They just want people to get on with it. And actually, they don't mind joining a party that doesn't give them huge democratic control. Maybe that's not what everyone wants. This is the argument put forward in the book by Stealth Democracy more generally, that actually people want some sort of participation, but actually generally they just want politics to be delivered. And maybe particularly the populist parties delivering that. So in terms of this kind of mixed message about how much power the membership has, where it doesn't have much power, that may be not a problem. Maybe that's emblematic of that. There are cases where you've seen parties having quite a lot of control of the membership, and that runs against, in a sense, this populist urge. But I think there is something about populism means that its appeal would shape the sorts of expectations we'd have. The last point I'm going to make is taken from the film Jerry Maguire. Again, I'm showing my age here, Tom Cruise. And it's a film all about a sports agent, and his client says, he has his catchphrase, "Show me the money. Show me the money, Jerry," he says. And I think with party models, I wonder about that. Why is it not more about the money here? Where's the money coming from? Because actually that both shapes the sorts of organizational choices that parties make, and maybe are a consequence of how much money they have. And if you look at the difference between the models of the parties, they actually often are differentiated on where the money comes from. The mass party says, we get the money from the membership. But we've seen most parties move away from that. They move to supporters, or sort of like, it's not really getting large amounts of money from the membership. They're not reliant upon that. The catch-all party links to civil society, to trade unions or the churches or so on, provide the money. Or for the electoral professional parties, from interest groups. It's sort of weird, isn't it? That therefore, I'm just struck. It'd be nice to push Stijn and maybe the other panelists about where they're getting their money from, and does that have an influence on the sorts of shape that they have? But I always think the funding of political parties and the way that they're organised are often intrinsically linked. But it's a fantastic. That's my only kind of negative comment, or to push people a little bit more information on that, and just to raise a question. But it's a fabulous issue. Do look at it if you're interested in party organisation. But as I say, look at it if you're interested in the country cases, and you can pick across them some really nice stories, well told, as Niko and Judith told us just now. Thank you.
Thank you, Paul, very much for your remarks. I'll start the questions. Some of these questions are directed to the speakers, but if the others want to step in and also add something, feel free to. There's a question from Pablo Gonzalez. I will ask Judith and Niko to answer about this. Okay, the question of Pablo is, broadly, do the right-wing populist parties' internal organization share any similarity with fascist parties? Perhaps Judith about VLAM's Belang, and Niko about the Finns party. What can you tell us?
Yeah, so I'm not an expert in fascist parties, but I'll do my best. And you're giving me an opportunity to say something I wanted to say. I think, so I talked in my presentation a little bit about discipline, party discipline, and a little bit about how the party needs buy-in from its members, right? And I think that's important. I think that displays a certain amount of the loyalty that party members display towards the party leader, displays a certain amount of acceptance of a kind of authoritarian logic. They're quite happy to, but at the same time, I think that can be overstated. We can overstate these kind of fascist intentions. I think some of it is what Paul said. People just, they want to be engaged, but only a little bit. They're not really that bothered about always starting fights within the party, right? I don't think the Vlaams Belang is, however, necessarily internally organized based on authoritarianism. I think it is very much based on a kind of a negotiation of interests. So traditionally with the Vlaams Belang, we've seen that there's always a few leaders and they're negotiating among each other. So I think that kind of acceptance of a kind of authority from the leader and that kind of charisma from the leader might tend towards, you know, comparisons to fascist parties, but I think we should be careful with applying the word to a party like the Vlaams Belang.
Thank you. Niko, can we hear your thoughts on the Finns party?
Yeah, I'd also kind of side with Judith in a sense that I wouldn't make a comparison between the fascist parties and the Finns party's organizational structure. Sure, in many ways, real power is centralized a lot to the top leadership in the Finnish party, but it's not centralized to an individual leader, but to a close circle of the people within the party executive. And also, in a sense, the party's members, they are not really striving for or are looking after a charismatic leader, in a sense that they are striving to be part of a movement that is able to channel the will of the people. And fair enough, some people appreciate more of a strong leader within the party organization, but they all appreciate the ability of them being part of a movement that also is able to change its leadership. And the Finnish party has now changed its leader twice within in just 4 years. So there isn't a problem in a sense of the party being able to change leaders. And it also shows that to a certain extent, the little formal power that the party members have, and that's relating to the party selecting new leadership every 2 years. So it's actually working.
Thank you. Thank you for our answers. Perhaps I would still stick with you, Judith and Niko, for a question by Aziz Sargin, asking which instruments do these parties, so we can use your case as well, use to reach out to migrants, given that most of all of them use an anti-migrant rhetoric, and interestingly, in recent years, we see that they manage to recruit migrants. Judith, can we hear your thoughts on this?
Yeah, thank you for asking this question. I'm actually writing a paper about this with our colleague Adrian Favero at the moment, so perfectly timed. Yeah, so I've just been looking at the data on this. I think that they like to say that they're recruiting migrants. And basically our paper is looking at the way in which they use kind of good and bad migrant narratives to allow for this recruitment. So they kind of use a narrative about economically and culturally, some migrants are good, acceptable, assimilated, and some are bad. And this allows them to have this kind of double speak of being both anti-migrant or anti-migration and allowing some migrants into the party. So one of the tools that's being used in Ninova, if you're familiar with the Belgian case, which I think you might be, is a kind of a migrant members of the Vlaams Belang social engagement kind of group, which is quite interesting. But when listing the migrants, it's notable that they were listing Bulgarian migrants, Polish migrants, Chinese migrants, Thai migrants, but very notably not migrants from places which have majority Muslim populations. And so we're talking in this paper that I'm working on about that. Also an interesting quote that I just looked at was a local party organizer saying, we really are trying to recruit migrants, but it wouldn't be like a Moroccan or anything. So that's their quote. So you can see this kind of double speak that they're engaging in.
Thank you. Niko, what about the Finns party in this matter?
In the Finns party, there are some migrant members, but they are very marginal. When it comes to the municipal elections, which are held every 4 years, on each of the municipal lists, there tends to be maybe one migrant candidate, and usually they are quite often entrepreneurs, meaning that they, for example, own a restaurant or some small business, and they are speaking more as with the voice of an entrepreneur more than a migrant. But I agree with Judith that there's this double speak of having these good migrants who pay their taxes and participate as good citizens in Finnish society. So yeah, it's definitely there.
Thank you. Stijn and Paul, I'll get to you very soon. But first, I'm going to read a question for Judith by Abhishek Kajuria, asking, regarding the use of social media. There was a stat which said that the social media posts of radical right outnumbered those of traditional ones by 5 to 1. Don't you think that the inability of traditional parties to capitalize on social media is actually in some way helping the radical right to become a mass party by enabling it more visibility? Mass party, the way you said, without a membership card?
Yeah, so I think that's an interesting question. Although in Belgium you see that the kind of left wing also has some vocal and charismatic, or popular, as Paul might say, online leaders as well. So I'm not sure that they're necessarily incapable. I think one of the things that the VLAMs Belang has really focused on is organic content. So putting content out there and getting their members to create content, which grows on its own. They also put a huge amount of money into it, right? So it's not just the amount that they're posting online. It's that they're posting content which should grow organically, and they're very good at that. And they take their inspiration from Trump, but also from Obama, from Austria, from all sorts of different. So they're kind of a learning organization in that sense. But they also put a huge amount of money into it. And there's statistics about that in my article. So I'll plug you to go have a look at that. But yeah, no, I think that they do focus on it a lot, but the other parties are okay at it too.
Thank you, Judith. Stijn, there was an expectation that I would also like to listen to Paul after Stijn's answer. There was an expectation of our audience, which is mostly academic, to know, and I know it's hard because Stijn, you just delivered this baby and now people are asking for the next one. What now? So this issue, if you had to reframe now a new issue, how would you do it? What's the next step when it comes to research on this topic? What's the next step?
Yeah, I think that the next step is what we're kind of doing with our project. I think it's opening the black box a bit further. And of course, we've already partly opened the black box, not only in the contributions written by our own team, but also several other scholars have used innovative data or interview data, etc., and really to dig down to the motivations of parties' elites to still invest in this mass party structure. Because the general idea is that, yeah, why would you still invest in it? In fact, when you don't need these people running around knocking on doors anymore, canvassing. If there ever was a golden age of the mass party, why would it be revived? But it seems to be the case that many of these parties still see the point in doing so. And responding or commenting on the last point of Paul, thanks very much for this. Yeah, this discussant role which you fulfilled so well and with so many interesting observations. Interestingly, whilst the mass party of yesteryear, it was also largely about member contributions. These parties relied on them to survive, whereas that's now not the case. And in fact, if we ask the party elites about what are the advantages or disadvantages of the mass party, in fact, finances are often mentioned as a disadvantage because it costs more money to sustain a mass party organization and to organize all these events instead of that it's really a main source of funding. So for these parties, and that's kind of the answer to this question, why do elites still invest in these mass parties? It's really about creating this community, kind of a critical mass really, that also pulls the party through difficult times. So having this core base of activists that do all this work for the party, that give it visibility and legitimacy on the ground, but also if times are bad, if they're going through an electoral slump, that are really key to the longer term survival. So that is already what we kind of discovered. So that's the first question: why do these parties still invest in it? And then the second question, of course, is, as I mentioned towards the end, is discovering the motivations of these people to be involved. And there, I also think Paul raised this very interesting point about these populist supporters or supporters of populist parties. They don't necessarily want to be involved, and I think that relates very much, especially to the right-wing populist idea of there being this general will, and that is what they often start out from. It's clear what the people want. It's common knowledge. We want to preserve our culture. We don't want too many cultural change. We don't want too many migrants in our country. That is what the people want. So we want to be part of this movement, but our leaders represent our interests. So people that subscribe to populist attitudes, I do believe what other scholars, including Cas Mudde, have said, like they want responsive leadership, but they don't necessarily want to be in control themselves. So yeah, I think opening that black box of what happens inside these parties, and that is something that's not sufficiently done, and we hope to contribute that to that by means of this project.
Thank you, Stijn, for your answer. Paul, some final comments, and also what's next in well, when it comes to research? You gave us a hint with the funding issue. What would you say?
I think just a couple of quick points. I mean, I think Stijn says it really well in terms of summarizing it, that actually the mass model is kind of counterintuitive, but there are other benefits from gaining a membership. I think that really fascinating. That came through with a lot of the cases. It's about recruitment, it's about community, which goes back to the point about social media. It's actually, sometimes that's not enough. The personal contact is actually really, really quite important. The other point I make is that I think we tend to dismiss populists, and they as Stijn says, they have a conception of the ordinary will, or sorry, the general will, or kind of the common people. But it's common sense, isn't it? We just want common sense to prevail. We don't have to actually have to do it. In a sense, they're kind of right. They are representing ordinary people, by they're representing the fact that people don't really necessarily want to be that engaged. They don't want to knock on doors. They're not the extremists that we often see, or more extreme versions in parties you see at the activist level. So in a sense, the populist parties are quite normal in a strange sense. They've normalized, and they are doing what they say. They're representing ordinary people in the way that perhaps ordinary people want to be represented, and we're the weirdos, we're the extraordinary ones. As for the future, I find that very difficult. I think just the two observations I make is I think it's really important when we study populism that we're clear about what it is we're studying. Are we studying authoritarianism? Are we studying right-wing populism? We disaggregate and be really clear about what the thing we're actually interested in. Too often populism is a vacuum cleaner of a concept. It hoovers up everything else. And everything comes into it, and we all think we're talking about the same thing, but we're not. We're talking about specific things. So I kind of want them to be lots of different futures, people doing research on different aspects. And the other thing is obviously clearly that the prevalence of populism in power, of Trump, of Bolsonaro, law and justice, and many of the cases in this special issue, that's to me that the really interesting thing. How does populism sustain itself in power? Something that Daniel Albertazzi has worked on in the past. I think we've got many more cases of that. So that's the really interesting thing for me to focus on. But let 1,000 flowers bloom. There shouldn't be a single direction, but they should be more focused is what I kind of think.
Thank you, Paul, for the notes. The concluding question, perhaps, of the webinar, again, to our authors, Judith and Niko, by Cristiano Gianola. I would ask you, he asks, how do right-wing populist parties mobilize emotions in their membership to call them to action? What communication strategies have you observed, and what other methods do they employ for this? Judith, can we start with you?
Yeah, so a good question, but a challenging one. I think maybe why we didn't touch on it, right? It's hard to conceptualize in a way that reviewer 1 and 2 like sometimes, I find. So I think that some of the strategies we see drawing on emotions in the VLAMs Belong are, for example, talking about security, talking about children. So, and touching on maybe a question another person asked, talking about welfare, right? So kind of creating this in and out group, this us and them group around security, welfare, education, and making people feel like, okay, someone's getting what I'm not, right? And this feeling of I mean, I think there's been a lot of discussion of the kind of left behind, certainly in the UK context, but making people feel, or touching on those feelings of being left behind, which I think are human emotions, right? I'm always the one being left behind. I'm always being left out. I'm not getting enough. So I think drawing on those kind of negative emotions, and then also where we see a lot is drawing on nostalgia, right? So drawing on feelings of, well, there was a better past, right? So a lot of my respondents talk about the better past, the nostalgic, symbolic past. So that on the more kind of positive side, but always paired with that negative side of someone's come and taken that from you.
Thank you, Judith. Niko, what about the Finns party in this matter?
Yeah, I'll just probably answer quickly that there's been a lot of discussion pertaining to the connection of emotions and the communication strategies of the populist radical right. But I think there's also interesting connections between the organizational side of things and emotions, in the sense that when people become really invested in their party activism, there's also a lot of emotions involved. For example, people might get into the organization incentivized, for example, by their political goals of opposing immigration or whatever, but quite often they stay for the friendships, for the warm emotions and good sentiments and moments that they share with their party colleagues. And that's also something that could be researched in the future, the connection of positive emotions and populist radical right party mobilization.
Thank you, Niko. We have reached the end of our webinar today. Two final notes. Okay, so the thematic issue in discussion today is available in the link I just sent again to the chat. It's, as always, fully open access. The final second note, this webinar was recorded and the video will be uploaded to our YouTube channel. So all the speakers and attendees, both who attended and not, will be able to access and watch and rewatch anytime. I would like to thank all the speakers, Stijn, Paul, Niko, and Judith for being here today. Also, special thanks to Daniele Albertazzi and the Populism in Action project for all the help in promoting these events. And of course, a final great note and thank you to our attendees for the questions and for interacting with our speakers. We'll see you all in our next webinar. Thank you very much.